There is a moment that can erase a lifetime of respect. A single moment when years of honor, sacrifice, and unwavering trust begin to crumble before thousands of watching eyes. It doesn't happen with a warning. It doesn't announce itself weeks in advance. It arrives without mercy, in the middle of an ordinary Sunday morning, when no one is expecting their faith in a man they deeply admire to be tested. The people inside New Hope Community Church believed they knew everything there was to know about their beloved pastor. For more than 20 years, he had become the face of compassion in his city. Families spoke of him with gratitude. Children had grown up under his guidance. Broken marriages had been restored through his counseling. Hungry families had received food because of his generosity. Struggling students had graduated because scholarships from his ministry changed the direction of their lives. If someone had asked the congregation to describe Pastor David Carter in one word, most would have answered without hesitation, trustworthy. That morning, no one imagined they were about to witness the beginning of a story that would leave an entire church questioning whether they had truly known the man standing behind the pulpit. The sanctuary overflowed long before the service officially began. Every pew was filled, extra chairs lined the aisles, and late arrivals stood quietly near the back, grateful just to be inside the building. The choir sang with joy, their voices filling every corner of the sanctuary as children dressed in white celebrated with innocent excitement across the front of the church. Elderly couples held hands during worship. Young parents carried sleeping babies on their shoulders. College students raised their hands in prayer. Visitors smiled as longtime members welcomed them like family. It felt like every other Sunday, yet it would become the one Sunday no one would ever forget. Cameras streamed the service live across the country. Thousands more watched from their homes, prisons, hospitals, and military bases, eager to hear another encouraging message from the pastor whose sermons had become a source of hope for countless people facing impossible situations. Nobody knew that within moments, the atmosphere would change so completely that many would later describe it as the longest silence they had ever experienced inside a church. Pastor David stepped onto the platform with the same calm confidence people had admired for decades. He greeted the congregation with his familiar smile, one that had comforted grieving families, welcomed strangers, and reassured people during some of the darkest moments of their lives. He had planted churches in forgotten communities where no one else wanted to serve. He had organized disaster relief after devastating storms swept through neighboring towns. He had quietly paid medical bills for people who never discovered where the money came from. When local schools struggled with funding, his ministry built classrooms and supplied books. When addiction destroyed families, he opened recovery programs that helped countless people begin again. Newspapers often featured stories about his charitable work, but those closest to him always insisted that the cameras never captured even half of what he quietly did for others. To many people, he represented what a faithful pastor should look like. Few realized that even those who dedicate their lives to serving others can carry burdens they are too afraid to reveal. He placed his Bible on the pulpit and looked across the sea of familiar faces. Smiles met his gaze from every direction. Some members nodded with anticipation, already expecting another message that would strengthen their faith for the week ahead. He adjusted the microphone and prepared to begin speaking. Then something happened that seemed completely insignificant at first. His phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. Normally, he ignored every notification until after the service. Everyone who knew him understood that nothing interrupted his time in the pulpit. Yet for reasons no one could explain, he reached into his pocket and glanced at the screen. The change on his face happened almost instantly. The warm smile disappeared. The color drained from his face so quickly that people sitting in the front row exchanged worried looks. His breathing slowed. His fingers tightened around the edge of the pulpit. The Bible nearly slipped from his grasp. His hands began trembling so noticeably that one of the associate pastors instinctively stood from his seat, unsure whether something was medically wrong. Whatever he had just read had shaken him in a way nobody had ever witnessed before. The congregation gradually fell silent. The choir stopped singing. Musicians lowered their instruments. Parents gently hushed their children without understanding why. More than 2,000 people watched as Pastor David stared at the phone for several seconds before locking the screen and slipping it back into his pocket. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Those closest to him could see fear spreading across his face. It wasn't the nervousness of someone preparing to preach. It was the expression of someone who had just realized that a part of his life he believed would remain hidden forever was suddenly standing at the edge of becoming public. Before anyone could ask if he was all right, the large wooden doors at the back of the sanctuary slowly opened. Every head turned toward the entrance. A woman walked in with tears streaming down her face. Beside her was a man whose expression revealed years of pain he had tried unsuccessfully to bury. Walking quietly between them was a little girl holding an old photograph tightly against her chest, as though it were the most valuable possession she owned. None of the three spoke a single word, yet their presence changed the atmosphere inside the church immediately. Pastor David looked toward the entrance, and for the first time in his ministry, the congregation saw genuine terror in his eyes. His lips moved almost silently before anyone could hear him whisper, "Lord, not today." Nobody understood who these visitors were or why their arrival had affected him so deeply. Had they come with devastating news? Were they grieving family members seeking help? Had they mistaken the church for somewhere else? Or was there another reason entirely, one connected to the message that had appeared on his phone only moments earlier? Questions flooded every mind inside the sanctuary, but no answers came. The silence grew heavier with every passing second as thousands waited for someone to explain what was happening. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story of Pastor David Carter did not begin on a crowded Sunday morning with frightened eyes and trembling hands. It began more than 20 years earlier, when he was just another young man with a Bible that was falling apart and a heart that burned with the desire to serve God. Long before television interviews, conference invitations, and packed auditoriums, David knew what it meant to have nothing. During the earliest days of his ministry, he couldn't afford an apartment, so he spent several nights sleeping inside an abandoned country church that had been damaged by years of neglect. The roof leaked whenever it rained, the wooden pews were covered in dust, and broken windows allowed cold air to sweep through the building every night. Yet David never complained. He would spread an old blanket across one of the pews, use his backpack as a pillow, and spend hours reading scripture by the light of a small flashlight until he eventually fell asleep. During the day, he worked whatever jobs he could find. He stocked grocery shelves before sunrise, cleaned office buildings late into the evening, and even washed dishes at a local diner just to earn enough money to survive. Despite the exhaustion, he remained devoted to prayer, often fasting for days as he asked God to use his life for something greater than himself. Those who knew him during those years often described him as a man whose greatest joy came from helping others, even when he had almost nothing to give. As the years passed, everything began to change. What started as a small Bible study in a rented community hall slowly grew into New Hope Community Church, where hundreds soon became thousands. Every Sunday, the sanctuary overflowed with worshipers eager to hear Pastor David preach. His sermons reached millions through books that climbed bestseller lists, television broadcasts that aired across the country, and conferences that filled large arenas. Churches from around the world invited him to speak. His ministry built schools, funded scholarships for struggling students, supported orphanages, and launched countless community projects that transformed lives. To the public, Pastor David seemed like the perfect example of faithfulness rewarded. People often smiled and said, "If anyone deserves heaven, it's Pastor David." But while the congregation celebrated everything God appeared to be doing through him, one person quietly noticed that something had begun to change. His wife, Rebecca, saw the difference long before anyone else. The man who once slept peacefully after long days of ministry now woke suddenly in the middle of the night, breathing heavily from dreams he refused to explain. He became unusually protective of his office, locking the door even when no one else was around. If a message appeared on his phone, he deleted it almost immediately. Whenever Rebecca gently asked whether something was troubling him, he would reassure her that he was simply tired before quickly changing the subject. Rebecca also noticed another strange habit that seemed completely out of character. Beneath the church was an old storage room that had not been used for years except to hold broken furniture, outdated sound equipment, and boxes of forgotten ministry records. For reasons she could not understand, Pastor David became extremely protective whenever anyone suggested cleaning or renovating the space. If volunteers offered to organize it, he politely declined. If staff members mentioned converting it into additional classrooms, he immediately redirected the conversation. His reaction was never angry, but it was unusually firm, leaving everyone with the feeling that he desperately wanted that room left exactly as it was. No one questioned him because they trusted him completely. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a young investigative journalist named Ethan Brooks received an anonymous envelope with no return address. Ethan had grown up attending New Hope Community Church before leaving town years earlier to pursue a career in journalism. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper containing just one chilling sentence. If the truth stays buried, innocent people will keep suffering. There was no signature, no explanation, no evidence. Just those 9 words. Within days, Ethan found himself driving back to the town he thought he had left behind forever, unaware that his search for answers was about to collide with the most respected pastor the community had ever known. But one question remained unanswered. Who had sent the letter, and why now? Within hours of that unforgettable Sunday morning, clips from the interrupted service flooded social media. Millions watched the moment Pastor David Carter froze after reading the message on his phone. Viewers replayed the footage again and again, trying to understand why one of America's most respected pastors suddenly looked terrified. Before long, speculation replaced facts. One headline questioned whether New Hope Community Church was hiding a financial scandal. Another anonymous account claimed a former employee had uncovered evidence of years of fraud. Others insisted there was a woman involved and that the tearful visitor had come to expose a secret relationship. None of the accusations were supported by evidence, but that didn't stop them from spreading. By Monday morning, the church office was overwhelmed with phone calls. Longtime members defended Pastor David with unwavering confidence, while others quietly wondered if they had trusted the wrong man. Bible study groups became filled with uncomfortable conversations. Families argued over dinner tables. Some refused to believe anything they read online, while others insisted there had to be some truth behind the rumors. The church that had always been united suddenly found itself divided by questions no one could answer. No one felt the weight of those questions more than Rebecca. After the service ended, she followed David into his office and gently closed the door behind her. For several moments, neither of them spoke. David stood silently with his back turned, staring through the window. Rebecca finally broke the silence. "David, please look at me." He slowly turned around, but his eyes remained fixed on the floor. "Tell me what's happening," she pleaded. "I've stood beside you through every challenge we've ever faced, but I can't stand beside something I don't understand." David took a deep breath before quietly answering, "I wish I could tell you." Rebecca's voice trembled with both concern and frustration. "You can tell me. I'm your wife." David closed his eyes. "If I say anything now, everything we've built could fall apart." Rebecca stepped closer. "It's already falling apart because you're saying nothing." David looked at her with tears beginning to form in his eyes, yet the words refused to come. Instead, he simply whispered, "I'm trying to protect everyone." Rebecca shook her head gently. "Or are you trying to protect yourself?" The question lingered in the room, unanswered, as David lowered his head once again. While confusion continued to spread throughout the congregation, Ethan Brooks began doing what he had been trained to do: follow the facts instead of the rumors. He interviewed former church employees, searched through public court records, reviewed archived newspaper articles, and spoke with people who had known Pastor David long before New Hope Community Church existed. Days passed without finding anything that supported the accusations of financial fraud or adultery. The more Ethan investigated, the more one thing became clear. The rumors everyone believed were pointing in the wrong direction. Then, buried inside an old county newspaper archive, Ethan found a small article published more than 20 years earlier. It reported that a young pastor named David Carter had been involved in a fatal automobile accident while driving home after several days of ministry and little sleep. Investigators concluded that extreme exhaustion had caused him to lose control of his vehicle. A young father lost his life in the collision. David had fully cooperated with authorities and was legally cleared after the investigation determined there was no alcohol, drugs, or criminal intent involved. Ethan stared at the article in silence before whispering to himself, This is what you've been hiding." But even as he continued reading, he realized the story was far different from what the internet was claiming. The records revealed that the victim's family had publicly forgiven David years earlier. They had even asked the community not to treat him as their enemy, believing the tragedy had been a heartbreaking accident rather than an act of malice. Yet something else caught Ethan's attention. Quiet financial gifts had been sent anonymously to the family for years after the accident. College tuition had been paid. Medical expenses had disappeared without explanation. Mortgage payments had occasionally arrived through anonymous donations. The identity of the donor had never been officially confirmed, but Ethan no longer doubted who had been behind them. Pastor David had spent decades trying to care for the family from a distance, while refusing to speak about the deepest wound of his own life. He had accepted legal forgiveness from the courts and compassionate forgiveness from the grieving family, yet he had never accepted forgiveness for himself. Instead of allowing God to heal what had happened, he buried the pain beneath years of ministry, hoping enough good deeds would somehow silence the guilt he still carried every single day. Determined to understand why the family had suddenly appeared at the church, Ethan arranged a meeting with the woman who had walked through those sanctuary doors. Sitting across from him, she held the same faded photograph her young daughter had carried that Sunday morning. "People think we came to destroy Pastor David," she said quietly. "That's the last thing we wanted." Ethan looked at her carefully. "Then why did you come?" Tears filled her eyes as she answered, "Because someone contacted us and said an old story about my father's death was being twisted into something it never was. They warned us that lies were spreading and that if we stayed silent, more innocent people would be hurt." Ethan leaned forward. "You forgave him, didn't you?" She nodded without hesitation. "Years ago. My mother forgave him too. Pastor David blamed himself every day, even after we told him to stop carrying that burden." Ethan asked one final question. "Does he know you're not here to accuse him?" She lowered her eyes. "I don't think he believes he deserves our forgiveness." Meanwhile, inside New Hope Community Church, the rumors continued to grow louder with every passing hour. Because Pastor David remained silent, people filled the silence with their own conclusions. Some members resigned from ministry. Others stopped attending altogether. News reporters gathered outside the church, waiting for a statement that never came. Rebecca watched helplessly as the man she loved became trapped between the truth he feared to tell and the lies multiplying around him. She knew the longer he remained silent, the more difficult it would become to restore the trust that had taken decades to build. Standing alone inside the empty sanctuary late one evening, David looked toward the pulpit where he had preached thousands of sermons about truth, grace, and freedom. Yet now he faced the hardest message he had ever been called to deliver, the truth about himself. The question was no longer whether the past would become public. The only question left was this: would Pastor David finally step into the light and tell the whole truth, or would he lose everything while trying to protect the image everyone had of him? The following Sunday, New Hope Community Church was filled long before the service began. The atmosphere was completely different from the joyful excitement of the previous week. Reporters stood outside the building. Members whispered quietly as they found their seats. Some had come hoping to hear the truth. Others expected Pastor David Carter to resign. A few believed this would be the final service before the ministry collapsed. Rebecca sat silently in the front row, praying with tears in her eyes. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what David was about to say. When the time came, he slowly walked toward the pulpit. There was no confident smile, no carefully prepared sermon notes, no inspirational introduction. He placed his Bible on the pulpit, looked across the sanctuary, and for several long moments, he simply stood there in silence. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "Church, today, I don't have a sermon. Today, I owe you the truth." The room became completely still. David's voice trembled as he continued. "For many years, you've thanked God for the work He's done through this ministry. But there's a part of my life I've never had the courage to talk about." He paused, struggling to hold back tears. "More than 20 years ago, before this church ever existed, I was driving home after days of ministry without proper rest. I convinced myself I could make it home. I was wrong." His voice broke. That decision cost a young father his life. Quiet sobs could already be heard throughout the sanctuary. "The investigation cleared me because it was a tragic accident caused by exhaustion, not alcohol or reckless intent. His family chose to forgive me, but I never forgave myself. Instead of bringing my pain into the light, I buried it beneath more work, more preaching, and more ministry. I believed if I served enough people, maybe I could outrun the guilt. I couldn't. Looking toward the front row, he continued, Rebecca, I'm sorry for shutting you out. You deserved honesty, but I gave you silence. Turning toward the elders, he said, I'm sorry for carrying this burden alone instead of allowing you to help me. Finally, he looked at the congregation. And to every one of you, I'm sorry that my fear kept me from being transparent. My silence allowed rumors to grow because I cared too much about protecting my reputation and not enough about trusting God with the truth. At that moment, and looked toward the family seated near the front. If you're willing, he said softly, would you please come up here? The woman who had entered the church the previous Sunday stood up with her husband and daughter. As they walked toward the platform, many people held their breath, expecting confrontation. Instead, the young girl looked up at David with gentle eyes before taking a small step closer. Her mother spoke first. Pastor David, she said, my father was the man we lost in that accident. The sanctuary fell into complete silence. She continued, our family forgave you many years ago because we knew you never intended for that day to happen. David lowered his head as tears streamed down his face. I've wanted to say those words to you for decades, he whispered. The woman gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Then hear them again today. She smiled through her tears and said, the prison wasn't ours anymore. It was yours. Before anyone could react, she embraced him. David broke down completely, and throughout the sanctuary, people began weeping. Rebecca covered her face as tears of relief poured down her cheeks, while several elders quietly knelt in prayer. That morning, something extraordinary happened. The church realized that secrecy, even when it grows out of shame instead of evil intentions, can still wound the people who trust us most. When the service ended, the elders gathered with Pastor David and announced new steps for the future. No pastor would be expected to carry life's deepest burdens alone again. They established a leadership accountability team, regular pastoral counseling, and confidential support for every minister serving in the church. As members slowly left the sanctuary, many embraced one another, grateful that truth had finally replaced fear. The ministry had not been saved by a perfect pastor. It had been strengthened by an honest confession, genuine forgiveness, and the reminder that healing begins the moment we stop hiding what God is already willing to redeem. Months passed, and while New Hope Community Church did not return to normal overnight, something far more meaningful began to happen. The crowd slowly returned, not because people had forgotten what had happened, but because they had witnessed something they rarely saw in today's world, a respected leader choosing truth over image. The empty seats that had once reminded the congregation of painful division gradually began to fill again. New families arrived, longtime members returned, and those who had stayed through the storm discovered that their church was becoming healthier than it had ever been before. The atmosphere inside the sanctuary changed. There was less pressure to appear perfect and more freedom to be honest. Pastor David Carter no longer stood behind the pulpit trying to convince people he had everything together. Instead, he spoke openly about God's mercy, the dangers of hidden shame, and the freedom that comes when we stop carrying burdens we were never meant to carry alone. One Sunday, he looked across the congregation and quietly said, "For years, I thought protecting my reputation was protecting God's work. I was wrong. The enemy almost destroyed my ministry with the one thing I refused to bring into God's light." The sanctuary remained silent before the congregation responded with a heartfelt amen. Rebecca noticed the difference more than anyone. One evening after a midweek service, she and David sat together in the now empty sanctuary. She smiled at him and gently said, "You're finally sleeping through the night again." David looked at her and smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "I forgot what peace felt like," he admitted. Rebecca reached for his hand. "Peace didn't come because the past disappeared," she said softly. "It came because you finally stopped hiding from it." David nodded. "I spent 20 years asking God to remove the guilt, when what he wanted was for me to surrender it." As they sat quietly together, Ethan Brooks walked into the sanctuary carrying a notebook. "Pastor," he said with a smile, "I came to tell you the article is finished." David looked at him and asked, "Did you write about the accident?" Ethan nodded. "I wrote about the truth, not the rumors." David lowered his head gratefully. "Thank you." Ethan smiled. "People don't need another scandal. They need to know what real repentance looks like." The impact of David's confession spread far beyond his own life. Couples who had secretly been struggling in their marriages finally sought help instead of pretending everything was fine. One husband stood during a testimony service and said, "Pastor, when I watched you confess, I went home and told my wife the truth about the debt I'd been hiding." His wife wiped away tears before adding, "It hurt to hear, but honesty gave us a chance to heal." Another woman shared, "I've carried guilt for something that happened years ago, and I believe God could never forgive me. Last week's message convinced me to stop running." One after another, people came forward, not because they had been forced to, but because they realized that freedom begins where honesty begins. Prayer meetings became filled with genuine confession instead of polished performances. Counseling rooms welcomed people who had once been too ashamed to ask for help. The elders who had established accountability among the leadership watched as that same culture of openness spread throughout the congregation. New Hope Community Church was no longer known simply for large crowds or powerful sermons. It became known as a place where broken people could stop pretending and experience the healing grace of God. Before concluding one Sunday morning, Pastor David opened his Bible and slowly read Proverbs 28 verse 13. "Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy." He closed the Bible and looked across the congregation. "Mercy was never waiting for me after I became perfect," he said. "Mercy was waiting for me the moment I chose to stop hiding." Those words remained with many people long after the service ended, and perhaps they remain with you today as well. If you had been sitting inside New Hope Community Church that morning, would Pastor David's confession have restored your trust, or would you still have chosen to leave? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share them respectfully in the comments below. If this story encouraged you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Redeemed Mind, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that God's grace is greater than hidden shame, and that healing truly begins when we bring what we've been hiding into the light. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.